Okay, so hello, my name is Hann Sutcliffe, they, them pronouns, and I'm the Manifesto Officer of Neurodivergent Labour.
Hi, my name is Nikki Hughes and I'm also they, them, and I am a Romani disabled activist and I'm Vice Treasurer of Neurodivergent Labour.
What we want to talk about here today, we want to talk about what challenges autistic people within the Roma, Gypsy and Traveller communities face in regards to accessing autistic support, education support, as well as similarities between the two communities, because sometimes I think we will separate people out into two camps and then assume that they have different needs and then just assume that it's because of what they are. And I think that does a great disservice to both communities, given that we live on the same island and often we don't talk. So, Nikki, first question I think would be, what is the current state that you currently know about? I'm a settled person. I don't know very much. I do live in Newark, which has one of the higher densities of traveller people. And currently there's a lot of legal battles going on regarding land and space. So I can imagine that for autistic people who need that level of settled, of routine, that can be quite stressful, particularly at a young age.
Yeah, so the first thing that I want to point out is that Irish travellers and Romanis are different ethnicities. So in the UK, especially, Romanis like to add Gypsy to the end of that. So they'll say Romani Gypsy. So they'll say I'm a Romani. European Romani prefer to say Roma or just Romani without the Gypsy. So you have Irish travellers, or they also call themselves mincers or pavi. And then you have Romani Gypsies, and then you have the European Romani. So even though like UK, we're the same ethnicity in Europe, there's a different culture because I don't think a lot of people realize that with Romani people, there are different tribes. So in the UK, the tribe that dominates in the UK is Romachals, and they tend to be also in America and Australia as well. So culturally, within the different tribes, there are differences as how they interact with the world, if that makes sense.
Yeah.
As far as I'm aware, I don't think, but I've been a Romani, I'm not an expert on Irish traveller culture, but I don't think that they have tribes. I think it's one culture. So in the UK, you have Scottish travellers who they're a mix between Irish travellers and Romani travellers, and Romani like gypsies, and then you have the Welsh Cale who are from Romani descent, but their culture is more matriarchal rather than patriarchal. So there's like difference in the UK how the different ethnicities and culture mess, and I think that's what a lot of people struggle to understand in the UK, because I think they hear like gypsy and they just put Romani and Irish people together, and they don't realize that other than nomadacy, there's not much similarity other than the discrimination they face, if that makes sense. So what you tend to find on permanent sites is that you tend to find, and I'm not saying this is a like generalized every single site is like this, but what you tend to find is that one site will be dominated by maybe Irish travellers, and then another permanent site will be dominated by mainly Romani gypsies. And it's just because of the different ways that our cultures work that it's easier for us to be together if we're living together, if that makes sense. So the problem with what's going on with the UK in terms of living condition is that you have that aspect of like Irish travellers wanting to live with Irish travellers, which is fine, and Romani gypsies wanting to live with Romani gypsies, but they'll be like, there isn't enough sites to accommodate either of those two ethnicities. So majoritively, Romani gypsies tend to live in housing now. I think it's like something like over 90%. are actually in settled homes. And I think it's for us, because nomadacy is something that was forced upon us, not necessarily cultural. We tend to have found that, like, through discrimination, Romani people have been forced to move on rather than it is embedded in a culture, although some Romani gypsies still enjoy being nomadic to a certain extent, because it's a part of our culture, in the sense of the community and living outdoors and cooking outdoors. You know, these things are very important to us culturally, but nomadacy all year round is not necessarily a thing that is like rigid into our culture, if that makes sense.
That makes sense.
Whereas I feel like with I feel like with Irish travel, it's a part of their culture to continue to move around. So what we found in this country, obviously, because there isn't enough space on permanent sites, and the pitches up, I mean, you're talking about maybe 15 pitches at the most. It's very, very small, these sites, and there's hardly any of them at all. So those who still want to persist in living a nomadic life are forced to constantly move around and are constantly evicted. So for somebody who's autistic, who needs routine, needs to be more settled, constantly being evicted, like turning up somewhere instantly, the settled community coming out, seeing things online about yourself, then having the police turn up, then having the bailiffs turn up, and seeing, you know, the adults, the males and the females, like arguing, sometimes fighting, do you know what I mean? Police brutality, all of those things are traumatic anyway, but I think for autistic people, that is a whole lot worse. And I think that's why a lot of the time when both ethnicities, Irish travellers and Romani gypsies, are faced with having a disabled child, they make the move to become settled, especially obviously access to the medical world as well is very difficult. Getting signed up with a GP, getting assessments, interventions, therapies, all of those need for you to be settled. So a lot of the time they give up that element to be settled.
And of course, given that these services are so stretched, you can be looking at months, years waiting lists. And for a child, that can mean the very difference, particularly given education stats and how difficult it seems that there's such a wide breadth of people seem to be massively failed by the education system. And can I just say that sounds like an amazing amount of people. It really does. I had no idea that there were so many different ethnicities and so much different cultures. It's truly beautiful. As someone who's part of the Morris tradition, I really appreciate, and I've hung around travellers and many of different tribes myself, because one of the things that Morris people really try to do is engage with the traditional culture of England, Scotland, Wales and Ireland. And it's a real privilege to be engaged with those communities. And this is why I think it's so important to bring these multiple communities together. But given that already autistic people face huge amounts of police brutality, it must be really quite difficult for the different various disparate communities to trust a system that has failed them so completely. And given that you have so little sites, which I know from experience are often underserviced, no water, no electricity, for an autistic child not being able to have free access to those things, I can really imagine really impact their well-being, not just as a neurotypical person, but as an autistic person especially.
Yes. On the other hand, I think what a lot of other people don't realise is that sometimes in settled community and that rigidness of life can be overwhelming for autistic people. So actually nomadacy can be a real relief for autistic people to have like more space to sort of run around, have a less of a rigid life. Sometimes can be like very good. Like, I know for myself that when, you know, I'm able to get out and live a part of my like culture when I go and meet family, because my dad, he still travels around and I have family who live on sites, and it's really nice to have that kind of break from the rigidness of everyday life and everyday phone calls and everything else. And I'm sure cell people can understand that as well, because, you know, when you go on holiday and so for some autistic people, yes, being settled is maybe beneficial for them, but on the other hand, like living more of a nomadic lifestyle and living more of like a rural lifestyle can be really beneficial.
So maybe then challenging this idea that all, again, coming back to a problem that almost all autistics face, is this idea that we are all rigid, we all work one way, and we all need a certain set of support systems, where in fact, it sounds like a lot of the different communities are actually well equipped to support autistic people given the services. So I can imagine this is something that we all have common interests in, having services that are more freely available, more drop-in, that don't require huge long wait lists. For myself, I know I like quite a settled routine. I like having my small area, but also I live rurally and I have that space. I have that ability to go out into nature. I think also maybe looking at, instead of focusing purely on what does this community need and can we break it down to an equation, but maybe looking at how we engage and give the community the tools and the respect and the resources that it needs so that it can better care for its people.
Yes, and I totally agree with that. I mean, there is a lot of stereotypes that go on, I think, with both communities and not being understanding around disabilities. And don't get me wrong, there are things within, and I'm speaking from the experience of as a Romani, sometimes terminology isn't great, understanding of disabilities and disability rights, there's still a lot of way to go. But like, a general feeling within the community is because we live culturally so different from settled people, it's more accepted. Like in my family, with me being autistic and my children being autistic, and there's loads of my family members who are autistic as well, and ADHD, there's a lot of neurodivergency in my family. And so for me being autistic, being as a kid, they were like, oh, well, you're just normal. Like almost neurodivergency in my family was normal. And they were like, we're all just a little bit strange. We're all just a little bit out there. So sometimes it's very difficult for people in those communities to guess that something else is going on until they go to education. And then once they go in education and hit the medical side of things, that's when they're told, oh, there's something wrong with this person. And they're told that it's a negative, it's a bad thing, and that they have to do something to cure them and to fix them. And that's when the negative tends to come in, I have found in my experience.
Yeah. And I suppose also there's the added complication of, is racism playing a part into this? Are you being cast as bad and not very social because you're part of, you're a Romani, you're a Gypsy, you're a traveller, so that's the reason you're just going to perform badly at school because you're this ethnicity, rather than going, actually, they have a support need that is recognised in settled people, but somehow make a person a traveller or a Rom Shell or a Roma, and suddenly it's just a case of they're bad, throw them out.
Yeah, that's what happened to me in school. I was diagnosed when I was a child. I've actually only in my 30s been diagnosed. So, yeah, it was a huge relief. So when I was younger and I started school, it's not that I didn't understand English or that spoke English, but like solely at home, we just spoke Romani. So when I went to school, there were things that I would say in our language that my teachers didn't really understand. And even now, Romani isn't seen as a language that is accepted within the schools. So like other language of the world, like people will understand that this person would need to learn English, whereas like Romani isn't really accepted that needs to happen. So when I went to school, a lot of my struggles were put down to that if I spoke or understood English better, then that would help me. If I speak English, the Queen's English, understand the Queen's English, even though I was born in England, so I understand English perfectly fine, and I speak English perfectly fine, then it was very much through my school life, it was put down very much to cultural. So when I would have a meltdown in school and smash up a classroom, that wasn't seen as a special educational need. That was seen as like, oh my God, she's Romani. They're badly behaved people. They don't discipline their children. They're rogues. That's what they do. They smash up things. They steal things. So when I was having a difficult time, and a lot of the time, when, especially when I was a kid, during my meltdowns, I would become quite violent. Like I wouldn't seek out people, but if you came towards me, like you were going to get a hit. Do you know what I mean? Where I grew up was, and my maiden name. So my maiden name is a very, very typical Romani Gypsy sort of last name. And my sort of lineage is very much like from prominent Romani families, if that makes sense. And the place that I grew up, it is a place that's history is associated with Romani Gypsies as well. I grew up on a council estate. Because of the amount of Romanis that lived on there, it was nicknamed Redskin Village, and a lot of people were terrified to actually go on. I think it's been described as a crime vortex. The connection for me growing up in that place with that history, everybody, regardless, there was no anonymity. I couldn't pretend to be from somewhere else or be something else. Everybody knew that I was Romani. And a lot of the schools that I went to had educated my dad, had educated my aunties and uncles, had educated my cousins. So like it was known. Because of that, when I walked into these schools, I was already labelled. There was already a label on me. So people couldn't look past that label to see actually that I had special needs. It's the same with my dad. So I now realize that my dad has undiagnosed ADHD. He hated school. So then he would bring his horse to school and tie it up on the goalpost in the field. And then obviously the teachers would be like, you know, you have to take the horse home. So he would sort of use that as an excuse because he couldn't cope with school. So obviously being his daughter, a lot of these teachers had already had dealt with my dad. So they were already like, yep, this is how it's going to be. I was actually diagnosed with dyslexia when I was in year 4. Although I didn't get any support for that throughout my school life. And I'm actually hearing impaired in both my ears. So that I've had since I was born. So they knew that. So I had no accommodation for my hearing loss and no accommodation for my dyslexia when I was at school. And I even had one teacher said to me, what's the point in educating you? You're just going to grow up and have children and cook and clean. That's all you're going to do. So it did come to a point where I was in high school. I would have 2 or 3 terms off of school, like going very, very rarely. And I was struggling. And then like culturally, like my mum wasn't really bothered. So therefore, my school wasn't bothered. You know, my school was like, oh, well, that's who she is and that's what they do. So, you know, we didn't have any absent teams or school ringing up to see how I was, anything that they could do. And I just about got my coursework in for my GCSEs, and I actually walked away with 5 A to C grade GCSEs, which is quite shocking. And I think to myself, if I was able to achieve that without the support and without the help and without accommodation, what could I have achieved with all of those things? The teachers would say, oh, Nikki is in intelligence, she just needs to work harder, she needs to apply herself. And in my mum's own way, like my mum would sort of kick off of that notion and go, no, she isn't, she's not like that at all, like she's struggling to do, you know what I mean? And my mum would be seen as aggressive, and a lot of the time like was just dismissed. And I don't think it's because my mum could really articulate what she was trying to get across in those sort of meetings. Even at the time that we had support from Traveller Education, which is a great resource, I think it's even for them, I think that they struggle to pick out special educational needs. So for me, being at school was extremely difficult, and I suppose that's why for me at this point as a parent I am so fierce in fighting for the support for my children, I suppose, because I empathize of what it's like to be at school with absolutely no support at all. I think that's what frustrates me, is that when it comes to education, by ethnicity, if I remember it rightly, the scores in English and maths receiving a level 5 or higher in GCSEs, 8.1 for Gypsies and Roma, and I'm not sure what was Irish Travellers.
Irish Travellers.
Yes. So for Romanis, it's 8.1, and then there is no special educational needs statistics for Gypsy and Roma. So if we're at 8.1% with neurotypical Roma, what are the likelihood for special educational needs Gypsy and Roma? It's likely to be a whole lot lower than that, to be honest.
And from what I can see from the data, the reason they discount it is purely by going, oh, there's not enough of them, which feels very dismissive.
It is. It's extremely insulting, because we have been in this country from at least the 1500s.
One of the things that I've often found, particularly in conversations with people who are, like myself, white and settled, there's often this kind of bemoaning, it's very modern, this very bemoaning lack of culture. And yet when you sit back and you go, actually, we've got a lot of culture. We just have segregated it off and said they're not part of our culture because they're the wrong kind of person, they're the wrong kind of life.
Yeah, I think especially for Romani people, we have always been othered. So we're never seen as part of this country, even though we have been in this country for centuries and a part of English culture. We're othered in this country. Like there's so much of our culture, like take rural life, for instance. Like we're a huge part of rural life we have just been like cut out and sliced.
One last thing, what could neurodivergent Labour do for autistic, traveller, Roma Shell, Romani Gypsy people?
So I would say, like at the moment, Neurodivergent Labour is supporting some local protests and campaigns that the community are doing over the summer from July until September, where in July we're going to be doing protests outside on Parliament Square to protest the new police reform bill, which within that is a trespass bill, which will make trespassing a criminal act rather than a civil matter, which will mean that the police can come and arrest you, can fine you, put you in prison, and take away your home, which is obviously, like I said before, with the lack of sites, that literally puts people at risk of being left on the roadside homeless. So we're obviously fighting that trespass bill. I think a lot of settled people don't understand that this also affects them, because if you like to walk, if you're a rambler, if you have a mobile home, if you have an RV or anything like that, it can
or a Morris dancer. The amount of trespass we've done is
yes. Exactly. So it can be as little as a toothbrush in your car. The police can say you're living in your car and remove your vehicle. So this is a huge problem of taking away civil liberties, and the government is using Irish travellers and Romani gypsies as a scapegoat to get other people to give up their rights by saying they're going to deal with the vermin problem, which is us, and that it would only target us and stop us from camping on fields and leaving rubbish and all that sort of stereotype stuff. But it does affect everybody, and it is giving up civil liberties. So, you know, even if you're an Instagrammer who likes to travel around and live in your car for a week, it's going to affect you. So yeah, anybody who even owns a mobile van or anything like that, it's going to affect everybody. So we're going to be protesting in July at Parliament Square and trying to lobby MPs. And there'll be a series of events at Appleby Fair in August to the Tory conferences. There are going to be certain events that we're going to be protesting at to try and get this change and to stop the police reform bill, especially this trespass bill, which will hugely affect, especially those who are nomadic. For neurodivergent Labour, I feel like the way that they can support is for the very first step of having me involved in accepting that we're a part of society. I mean, it'd be great if we could have somebody who represents also the Irish travellers, but yes, representing, like having somebody on board and realizing and accepting that we are an ethnicity, help to include GRT people in like manifestos and things like that, to include us into things that are going to like legislation to take place, to lobby with us, of course, and to just, you know, to be able to include us and have our voice be a part of neurodivergent Labour is really, really important. Because it's nice to be included, and like you said, like the statistics, we're never seen as something that needs to be part of the statistics. So we have no idea how neurodivergencies, how many GRT people are neurodivergent. We're not in any studies. We don't know how many people in education are affected through special educational needs, how many have things like ECHPs. You know, we have no idea, and we're not even collected within the NHS directory. We're not even part of an ethnicity on there. So we don't have any statistics to back us up, despite the fact that we face huge barriers and huge discrimination in this country still. So it's fantastic to just have our voices heard, and neurodivergent supporting our community and backing us up and being somebody who includes us and backs us up in things that we face. That's how I think like neurodivergent Labour can help.
Full solidarity. That's what we need. Full solidarity.
Yes, exactly.
It's been an absolute pleasure having this discussion, and particularly with Kill the Bill. I know I've heard from mostly settled autistic people, particularly with a public nuisance. They're very afraid to go out into streets now in case they have a meltdown or they publicly behave in a weird way and then be targeted for police harassment. So in many respects, there is more similarities than there are differences, and I think that is ultimately the message, that as a settled person and as a Rom Nichelle, we can say we have more similarities than differences, and solidarity is what's going to bring us together.